Actually, I'm going to go real quick. The important thing on the title here, I think, is it relates to the trust and the innovation that is happening, and relates to the volunteer work I'm doing with the IEEE, and that's in the area of Internet of Things. And I am chairing the steering committee within the IEEE that's helping drive its standards presence, its innovation activities there, and collaboration around the world. And all the things that Karen talked about with respect to standards organizations, even though the IEEE is large, it cannot really do it alone. So I thought I might do something a little bit different than most presentations. I go to my last slide. If I only get 2 minutes, I guess I can say thank you. But really, what we see within the IEEE is that we, as standards practitioners, to help foster the innovation that's in front of us, need to do a better job of collaborating, and we need a unifying force that's going to help us actually do that, because we've got to bring the standards organizations, governments, regulatory bodies, corporation, technologists, and the like together, and do it in a way that we don't impede, but we enhance innovation. And if we just take a look at even what we thought we knew what we were doing when we're starting to do things, when we were working on the Wi-Fi, the 802.11 standard, we were doing this to promote wireless cash registers, and look what we've ended up. I don't know how many of you are on Wi-Fi today, but we didn't intend that was going to be what you're doing at this moment. We're happy that we ended up there. And so my conclusion might be that for the last 115 years, where the IEEE has been developing standards and delivering value to the world, that you can trust us to collaborate with you and others to continue that innovation. And we know the problems in front of us in terms of a safe, secure, trusted world, especially with more and more devices being connected, is going to fall on the shoulders of a lot of different organizations, a lot of different people, yourselves included. So that's my maybe 3 minutes.
I'm going to break with tradition, and I'm just going to sit here at the table. And the sort of comment Dennis said's great. Most presentations have to have a beginning and an end, and you got both of them. So one of the important things for me around, oops, I probably shouldn't touch that. How about that? One of the important things for me about when we start looking at standards is the word open. There's a lot of standards out there, and when we start looking at standards, it's very easy for standards to become monopolies and to eliminate competition from, or eliminate innovation in terms of what we're trying to do. And so my focus is pretty solidly on the open side. My open source roots sort of brings into that. And so as we start having the discussion to have a look at the differences and how things play out between open standards and standards, but not necessarily quite so open.
I won't touch it either, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't think it's any secret that Ping has been committed to standards for a while, and sort of my role and the way I look at it is I try to step onto the outside and look in, so we don't really kind of get sucked into the vacuum that can happen in a standards development, or even when you start to, with strict adherence to standards. I also have a column that I write on ZDNet called Identity Matters, where I try to take an IT view of standards and standards adoption, where they're moving, what sort of benefits they may be enabling. So I try to take a look at the standards process from sort of the end user's perspective and see where the value is.
So I'm going to touch the microphone. So I'm just going to get like nice and close to John here. So I'm Scott Morrison now. And as Karen mentioned, I'm the CTO of Layer 7. Now, Layer 7 actually doesn't exist anymore, I'm happy to say, as an independent entity. We got acquired by CA Technologies about a year ago. So now officially I'm a distinguished engineer at CA, which means I actually have a coat with patches on the elbows and things like that. So I will attempt to be as distinguished as possible with this august panel that I'm very happy to be on. Layer 7, at least through its entire lifespan, actually did a lot of work in standards. And very early on in our days, we recognized that there was a tremendous importance to get in there and essentially mix it up with the big guys. Over the years, we've pulled back a little bit. And now, of course, now that we're part of a larger entity, we're kind of seeing it from the ground up. And we're very much, as an organization within CA, looking at the bigger picture of where we're going to go. CA, of course, does a lot of work in standards and very much supports market-driven open standards. And this is a very, very important thing for the company, and we've put a lot of money and effort into it over the years in a leadership role with the large standards organizations. That's going to continue. That's something we still very, very much believe in, and we see the pendulum coming back into standards again. I think a lot of organizations backed off, over the last 5 years or so, especially after the big WS Death Star approach to standards. But standards are back, and standards are really important again, and we're seeing that with everything from OpenID Connect and OAuth, to many other standards in areas that are unrelated to identity. And so this is something that CA is deeply interested in, and we will continue to work in, and I hope to see a lot of you on many of these committees.
Well, thank you. So with that, we're going to launch into our more Q&A and discussion part of it. And again, I really just encourage everyone, I know it's early on a Saturday morning, to ask any questions, put forth any comments that you may have. So just to kick us off, but the idea here is just to let the flow go, have a good conversation. But I'll just pose one question right now to start those creative juices going, is how can standards developed in a bottom-up, open, market-driven process, which we call open standards, how have your organizations or your experiences, how have you witnessed that, or the value of that, or the lack of value of that?
Karen, looking at it, I think the standard serves as a base from which other things can grow and expand and build on. Sometimes they can lead and they can set a bar to which we all rise to, but they also will cement that which we can agree on and come to some conclusion on. But not just the sense of it being open and available or a voluntary standard. We also like the aspect that if you're going to be a market participant, that you might be able to rely on the global adoption of the standard as well, so that you can build a product once and it can be consumed everywhere. And I think even obviously in the internet age where products can take off quickly, games and all the other things, apps can become overnight wonders. We want to do things that will actually help increase the pace of adoption, and global standards, ones which can be easily and readily adopted by all, help quicken that pace and allow market ventures and companies to build once, but then have them consumed all over the world. And so I think that's the essence of I think what underpins the acceptance of these is that you're not in it to, and I think maybe Alan, you're trying to say open but closed to create winners and losers, but allow anyone to become a winner if they wish to participate and support the standards.
Absolutely. From my perspective, the sort of thing that we end up looking at when you look at standards bodies and the kinds of people who get involved in standards bodies tend to sort of differentiate themselves fairly obviously. There are people who actually fundamentally believe in what they're trying to do and are trying to solve a particular problem. And then there are other people who are trying to build a market. Now, not that those two things are necessarily exclusive. They're not. Many of us are trying to solve problems we're passionate about and trying to build a market because that's what pays the bills, and there's sort of no buts about that. But the motivations for coming up with the standards tend to be slightly different. When you are trying to build a market, the kinds of thought process that you come into things is to trying to obviously maximize one's own position and make it harder for other people to end up playing into it, use the technology that you've already got. And history is sort of littered with various standards that we thought were great at the time. And anybody still using 5 1/4-inch floppy disks? I mean, they were great standards at the time, but we've sort of moved beyond them. And so very often the standards are there to solve a problem that we're trying to work right now. It's also trying to solve a problem that is considered too big for a single enterprise to try and solve, or a single company, a single vendor, a single implementation to try and solve. Not that that hasn't been done as well. There's been some very good standards that have been developed by a single company. But in general, we look at it, and the benefits that we have of standard is interoperability. The benefits that we have of working with an open standard is that anybody can play in the game, we can work together, we can provide an industry-wide solution to a problem rather than a enterprise or a company-focused one where we all have competing technologies. And going back to the 802.11 that we were talking about and the Bluetooth standards, there was a time, and it's not that long ago, it's probably measured in terms of months, when many of us probably had 3 or 4 different kinds of local area devices. I remember you could go down for $19 and buy a mouse that would connect wirelessly to your laptop, but it didn't use the same dongle or the same protocol that the keyboard used, and so we solved that by getting USB extenders. And we can now have multiple dongles sitting out there. And then Bluetooth comes along, which gives us a standard that they can all work with. It's sort of the example of where an industry is able to be built around something rather than a particular enterprise.
Yeah, I was, to sort of boil up what you guys have been saying, I mean, I think that for, at least from an enterprise perspective, that standards equal options, right? You're not going down a rat hole. Years ago, I covered Oracle and talked to a lot of IT guys, and their choices were limited to the standards that Oracle had offered them as they were building out their CRM apps or whatever, their financial apps. And so the whole standards infrastructure, to me, provides you with those options, and you're not getting dug down into one certain choice or a range of choices. And the standards as they evolve, you can, Scott mentioned the WS standards. That's all part of the process as far as I'm concerned. What we learned from that was that we needed to build things more efficiently, and we came up, we've got RESTful protocols now, and the whole standards process is a learning process. And sometimes we get into these religious wars. This standard isn't any good. This standard is better. Sometimes the standard is good for a certain length of time, and we learn from it and we move on. So the standards process is a mechanism that affords us these choices as we go forward.
So let me speak, as an architect and somebody who really likes to build technology. In the end, I'm a capitalist. I want to make money, okay? I want to build stuff that actually sells and is effective in the market, and I want to compete effectively. And the nice thing about the whole, open standards thing is the first thing I'm going to do is go out and look at something I can align to. And I want to do that because it lets me get a bit of a force multiplier on my staff. Because effectively what I'm doing is I'm harnessing other people. I'm harnessing the brain trust, the smart people around here. And I'm not going to compete based on the stuff that's standardized, because that doesn't make any sense. I'm going to compete on all the other things. I'm going to create IP around that. But in all of the pieces that can be shared and all the pieces that define integration and things like that, I'm not going to differentiate there. It doesn't make sense for me to differentiate there. It makes much more sense for me to line up against things. So I think part of the beauty of standards is they benefit us all, and they really let us focus our innovation where the innovation should happen. If we don't have standards, then essentially we all start competing on the low-level infrastructure and things like that, which really doesn't move us along much. So the beauty, I think, of open standards is fundamentally that we get to share on the stuff that we shouldn't really be competing on. Look at like trains and subways and things like that. Imagine if we were trying to innovate and compete based on the gauge or the width of railways. We wouldn't get very far. The fact that there's a standard that we can line up to, at least certainly within Europe, North America, and other places like that, lets us build really, really fast trains and things like that, and begin to, fundamentally innovate where we should be innovating and differentiate where we should be differentiating.
I was going to say, to your point, maybe a bad example, but when I covered Microsoft for a long time, and they used to say, at least the research guys, that we're going to compete on implementation. And that's really what it should boil down to, and that's where the innovation happens.
Yep. Yeah.
So with that, what would you say to the people who, the naysayers, if you will, that say standards and standardization process stifles innovation or slows it down?
Prove us wrong.
I think it does. I mean, it's sort of the cost of doing business. Yes, if you are a small, single-controlled shop, you could probably come up with a solution to do something maybe slightly faster than you can as a standards body. We all know that standards bodies operate on a glacial time frame, especially when in engineering offices we work in days and weeks, sometimes hours. You go to a standards body, you're definitely talking months and maybe more. So the speed of being able to get to market, absolutely, I think it does have an impact. The thing for me is that standardization gives us a standard frame of reference so we can communicate with each other. And yes, it's quite possible, and sort of if we look at it back and compare it to something like English, or actually any spoken language, I'm not coming down on France at all, but but if you take a language like English, it's quite possible that a small group of hunters using specialized grunts can probably be pretty efficient at catching their food, but the standardization of the communication that we can now as a society move to means that there's a lot more opportunity, a lot more things that we can use to build on top of that, including great conferences like this, where we can talk about those things. And that's where I think the standards fit in, right? English is really a standardization, and it allows us to communicate and talk to each other at higher levels than simply 5 volts and 0 volts and bits and bytes.
Actually, that's a great, I was going to say, it's a great metaphor, actually, because linguists look at the evolution of language, and languages always go through certain jumps in their evolution, where things like, long vowels will appear in that. And what's interesting, I think, in particular about English, is one of the reasons English is such a torturous language to learn, is that it went through that sort of long vowel evolution kind of around, the same time as writing in that, and it was being codified. And so a lot of our sounds versus how we actually write the language are kind of out of whack. And I think it's a good example of what happens in standards a lot of the time, where you get like these waves of innovation. And then what happens is the standardization comes in afterwards and sort of cleans up a bit of the mess. And I think right now we're in one of those waves of innovation. I think we kind of the pendulum has swung towards really going out there and just constantly building, and we're seeing tremendous interest in innovation and stuff coming out all the time. And everybody in this room is very much a part of that. And then all of a sudden the standards start to come in and recognize where you can begin to codify. And that's the equivalent, as Alan pointed out, of the language coming in and the written language coming in. And so ideally that should swing around again. And so we will begin to move into a much more standards-led approach. And so I think the two play off each other very, very well.
I was going to comment a bit on that as well, but from the point of the leadership of the standards and how we get to the point of even having them. We've done some experiments, this is within the IEEE, and have adopted a process where we're able to bring industry together and sit at the table pre-standardization and talk about what we might want to have happen and who would be consumers of it. So producers and consumers are sitting at the table, and we had several large consumers of technology basically say, if we're able to come up with a standard, we'll buy. And that motivated us out of the lethargy, Alan, that you talked about. We were actually, in 18 months, we have a completed standard, a lot of tests from producers in flight, and a market formed around it where the standard was actually the active catalyst to help actually accelerate the adoption of this. And certainly even those that would be collaborating in terms of producers of other side technologies saw what some of the large anchor companies were doing around the world, and the market fell into place almost rapidly and rather orderly. And so standards themselves can also be used as a tool to help gauge the pace of innovation as well.
I think that model was, you had the old graybeards of the IETF back in the day, and I say that with all due respect. But, you know, the process became criticized for being so slow, and then you had IBM and Microsoft got together, they kicked off all the WS standards, all the XML standards, and they started selling it, and then they brought other people in to support that. We got what we got out of that. That result was somewhat criticized, but that model has perpetuated a bit, but you see now that some of the standards, like an OAuth has gone to the IETF, and some of those standards are now going back into some of those more respected standards bodies and being developed there, where I think there's a little bit more trust in those bodies and the longevity of it. But you know, you have two things that are diametrically opposed: innovation, which is happening at lightning speed, and standards that are very, very slow. And so, to Scott's point, you know, they sort of overlap. But I do agree that the standards, like an OAuth, I think is really, it's there. It's you know, whatever side of the debate you might be on, it's there. Mobile operators are taking, and people who are interested in developing mobile apps and for the mobile platform are taking advantage of that, even though it's being criticized for some complexity and other issues and stuff like that. But that is being you know, pulled into the whole mobile debate, and I think it really kind of is ratcheting up what's happening on the mobile side.
There's a question out there.
Go ahead.
It's Connor Logan. I'm from Creative Arts Agency down in Los Angeles. And I cut my teeth the last 15 years doing identity management, where it seemed like as time progressed, for what it's worth, it got more elegant into the last few years, where it's just all entropy. And at the same time, moving from industry and healthcare to industry and entertainment, where I'm not subject to the same compliance standards I used to be. The speed of development is paramount. The speed at which I architect a design and continuously deliver on that design is paramount. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how I can buffer, how you can still maintain and prohibit your development from becoming lost as the standard comes up, but still delivers to your business. Because I find I'm having to move very quickly and make quick decisions about what I'm going to build, what I'm going to architect on, what I'm going to use, what I'm going to task my team on how to deliver the solution. But if I make the wrong decision, I could be spending a lot of bad money and not getting money.
There are business consultants that are charging lots of money. and therein lies the problem, right? And there is no guarantee that we're going to do something that's going to work. And the reality is that, especially in the software space, we have a lot of very smart, intelligent, capable people, and not every work of art becomes, you know, a Da Vinci. It's a lot of it simply becomes firewood. And this is sort of one of the things that standards does for us. Is it does for software what peer review does for science, right? And from an enterprise's, from our customers' perspective, knowing that a good number or all of the people in the industry have looked at this and given their stamp of approval gives us that peer review thing, right? It's like, okay, this is not just a flash in the pan. The number of times you can hear somebody talking about some software saying, oh, this is a breakthrough technology, it's unlike anything else, we've done this great new thing. And you always listen to that with a certain amount of skepticism, right? It's like, okay, there's a lot of really smart people working on this. What gave you the sort of insight and the genius? And that's really where the standards give you a way to go with. So tracking on the standards and tracking early on the standards groups, right? That's really where groups like Kantara, OpenID Foundation, OASIS, IEEE, all of them across the different sort of scopes, that's where the standards bodies form. That's where we get together and talk about, you know, something that's not working is this. We need to do something about that. And getting involved is a good way to know where the industry's going.
I think one of the examples of that is the development of SCIM, you know, for provisioning, and that came out, and it was very, very simple. You know, you could add and create and delete, and And it was criticized, we're like, well, this is too simple, we can never use it, which was funny because the debate previously to the other standard developing, which was SPIML, was, well, this is way too complicated, we can't use it. So it started off with a baseline and something that should be a foundational that you could build off of. And then other extensions and other things are being added to it. So you can track through the standard if you want and get as sophisticated as you want, but you still have those base capabilities for something that you might be building. And is it going to work? Well, or is that model going to work? Well, we'll see. But it definitely is sort of a different way that started out. I mean, there were actually companies that wouldn't get involved in it, into the standards process, into building it out, because they just thought it was useless. But once they saw that, or realized that from the IT side, from the outside looking in, they were saying, give us something that's simple that we can use, that we can deploy on top of what we've already built. That's going to give us some value, and then we'll try to grow along with it.
So Connor, you have the unfortunate timing to be like an identity architect in basically the Cambrian explosion of identity. There's going to be a lot of dead bugs smeared on rocks when, at the end of this whole thing. But the thing is, definitely hedge all you can and keep an eye on the analysts who are tracking this stuff. And they're I think as both Alan and John said, things filter up, and there's kind of a community buzz about certain standards. OAuth is obviously one of them. SCIM is another one. OpenID Connect is certainly another one. There's other ones on the horizon, like UMA and things like that, which are going through Kantara. They're definitely worth keeping an eye on. Keep an eye on all that and look at the profiles that seem to be winning out within those. And analysts are a good place to go, but obviously not the only one. You have to do a lot of your own research. And in the end, it's a leap of faith. And you just got to sort of decide what you're going to do and hedge wherever you can.
We had a question back there. Oh, no, I'm sorry.
We got 3.
There's questions all over the place.
I think the question is that the next session, not just break the ice, simplify and accelerate adoption.
About the gentleman's back.
Hi, I'm Andrew Hughes. I work with Kantara and the IDMB on trust frameworks. You guys are doing a great job talking about the technical standards and technology standards. That's all great, but not my particular interest. What about policy and process standards? In my dealing with trust frameworks, we're kind of stuck, it seems. So identity proving process, for example. Lots of different variants, all doing the same thing in unique ways. So no one can share anything coming out of anyone else's process. So how do we, first of all, is there standardization going on on the policy and process? Where is it? And what kind of insights are you having on that? Or am I wrong?
Okay, I'll jump in. So one of the advantages we've got with technical standards is we've been doing it for 100 years. And, we cut our teeth, well, I didn't, but we cut our teeth on railroad standards and transistors and, sort of moving up through that space. I think that one of the problems we've got in terms of the process is that, any graph you look at now in terms of almost anything, adoption, number of devices, number of whatever we're dealing with, is becoming an exponential graph. And this is where those trust frameworks and identity proofing and things like that are actually becoming real issues. And the biggest challenge with that is that it ends up being very much a regulatory issue. You end up having to intersect a lot. And I'm going to do Elena here, and I'm going to say on the third session today, we actually have some that are going to be looking at directly that, where we have impacts of governments needing to do those kind of identity proofing problems. In general, we haven't had this problem. The way you identity proof is someone goes to the front desk and shows their driver's license. Done, right? So now we've got a scale of problem that we haven't really had to address. We haven't had to address the governmental things and the regulatory issues, and we're trying to get into them. So Kantara, IDESG, all of these groups, and there are some significant government-driven groups as well. The NSTIC and IDESG was government, let's say government-initiated, right? And ANIL and the GSA is pushing a lot of these kinds of things and trying to recognize where the problems are. I think it's just a younger space. And as being a younger space, we've got to learn what's there. We haven't explored all the hidden corners on it yet. And you kind of got to do that before you can standardize.
I think one of the firecrackers in the room there too is probably liability. When you talk about trust, there's a lot of liability involved. So, if you're going to adopt SCIM, your liability is that, well, the thing might blow up and your project might blow up. But, when you take on that trust stance, there's an opportunity that your company may blow up because, you let so-and-so into the China shop and they destroyed it. So that's a huge hurdle to get over.
Wish I could give you a nice answer.
You'll be fine.
Yes, absolutely, which is why groups like IDESG exist.
I think we had a question.
A couple questions. As a normal architect, how do we get involved with the groups that are doing all the standards? We obviously right now we consume the standards, but how do we get involved with those groups and we can help drive some of these standards in the different industries that we all work in? So that's one of the questions. And then the other question is, how do you address when we have standards that blow up in our face and then all of a sudden we have security breaches and things like that? They weren't following the standards.
I think the first page of all the standards is no liability is assumed, so you're on your own almost, which is a sad part. But getting involved, I think each group has its own way of bringing membership in. And one of the things I know we've learned from the IEEE and the fact that we're collaborating with more and more groups around the world, each has its own distinct identity and way of operating. We've got groups in China that are doing service overlays for internet and other wireless stuff, and their meetings are all conducted in Mandarin. So even if you become a member, you may have to speak the language in which the technical discussions are being held as well. We don't want to legislate or prescribe any one way of doing things. So if there are groups you want to belong to, most of them have obviously an online presence. And if they're represented here at this conference, people are probably here you can interact with as well to actually become members. I don't know specifically, Kantara, what the requirements are to join. But the IEEE, different groups have different schemes by which you can become a member.
I would say, I'm assuming you're an end-user organization, a company. Most standards bodies are dying to get your viewpoint in them, so it's fairly easy. There's an interop, I think Knock Knock, are you doing the interop this afternoon? Is later this afternoon in the afternoon track, and there'll be representatives from a lot of those different standards bodies that'll be there. I know a lot of those folks. I'm more than willing to introduce you to anybody you want to meet. Ask me afterwards which ones you're interested in.
We have a ton of expert architects in our organization, and we drive standards within our organization and we also outside of our organization.
I'm sure we can hook you up with 4 or 5 people that are here that could, for the various bodies.
We're the game at consumer able to do so.
So one of the most valuable and important jobs in any one of these standards organizations is that of volunteer coordinator. Almost all of the organizations, there's a few of them that don't quite work this way, but almost all of them, the standards bodies are made up of volunteers. With Kantara, it's a case of come to the website and sign up. With other ones, you have to join them. In general, the joining fees are trivial to most enterprises. They're in the realm of hundreds or maybe a couple of thousands of dollars kinds of things to join and become part of those organizations. Once you're members of the organizations, signing up for the groups, they are begging for participation. And participation from people who are willing to do work, these people are gold-plated, right? Every single group is dying and begging for those people. And so I think we have probably done a bad job in general in the different standards organizations in trying to generate interest in getting people to come into them, because most of us are doing those because it's a passion. But it is actually very easy to get involved into them, and beware, it can consume your life.
But it's a good thing, like I would say that it's important, and it sounds like you're very much in that position where you have to get the buy-in, from your organization itself. And once you've got that, it's usually really, really easy internally in your organization to find, architects, developers who want to try out the standards process. I find I talk to a lot of our developers who would, they don't really understand the process, and they think, oh, standards are made off like at the UN or something, and it's impossible to get in there, and you have to be elected by the government or something like that. And as everybody said here, the truth is it's much more open and transparent, and these things are only as good as all of us, contributing to them and making the effort. And usually when your own architects and developers in an organization start to understand that, they also realize that it's actually a good thing in their own career to try out and to, do, because it's something you can put on your resume. It's, it's good for you as a person. And you get to contribute. And a lot of people, and I felt this myself the first time I got involved in standards. I felt like I was actually doing something, of real importance there. And so the key thing, though, is to get management buy-off in that, because it is it can be a big suck of time. It's, and everybody has to agree to, come to meetings and things like that. But once you get that, honestly, the standards committees will, they'll embrace you with open arms. They would love to have you involved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things. Yeah, there's good standards out there. But to get an organization to agree to use those standards because they are coming from an outside entity that maybe they don't trust that well, you don't get the standards adopted because they don't trust or understand what's going on before.
The trust, I was just going to say the trust thing in particular, that was the second part of your question. I think in terms of the standards and trust and security in particular, the best thing we have going for us is transparency. The nice thing about standards is they're out there, they're open, there's a lot of people looking at them. And we have to separate out, trust issues with open source with trust issues with open standards. Yes, we get a lot of things like Heartbleed and things like that, but that's really implementation specific. That's about a piece of open source that had some issues in it. Whereas open standards we do go through a refinement process. I mean, look at SSL, version 1, 2, and then went to TLS, and there is a process of refinement, but it's very, very open, and it has a lot of eyes on it. And that's actually a really good thing. That's probably as good as the Commons can do in terms of creating a lot of trustworthiness.
However,
around it.
there are those that are against that in a way. On behalf of the IEEE, a few of us went to visit a car company CTO in Munich, Germany. And when we got there, they said, internet, and they brought their IT people in. We said, no, we're here to talk about the data transmission in your car and should you be moving in that direction and whether you ought to get engaged. Because obviously in an automotive company, if a standard blows up in your face, they may not come after the IEEE, but they'll go with every practitioner of that who has indemnified them, and they'll liquidate your company for all the damages you might have caused even using a standard. So their solution to that was actually, let's just keep it private. We'll do our IT data management. We'll put our movies and music on your network, but we'll define the standard, AUTOSAR, and we'll force all of our suppliers to adopt it. And that way we'll protect ourselves, because even though it's open, transparent, and you can see whether it should be good or bad, they still didn't have the trust that being open and scrutinizable was insufficient to prove that it was going to be reliable.
Oh, them be fighting words.
Now the panel gets interesting.
So your first comment about the security aspect, right, is that how do you prevent, if you are exposed to a flaw from something that is in a standard? And the reality about that is, first of all, none of us are smarter than anybody else. Every single company out there and everybody involved, we are all smart, we are all capable. And so any kind of imagination that upper management has that it and it alone controls the world's geniuses on this particular problem, and everybody else is stupid, is living in the clouds, right? It's just not, it's not the case. If you run into a problem and are using an open standard, what ends up happening is that, yes, you're facing it, but so is everybody else who adopted the standard. And typically, minutes later, there is a fix, or there is an analysis of it. And, you know, them words about that open source stuff. And Heartbleed is a great example of that, right? There are bugs in every piece of software, whether it's proprietary software or not. And the number of breaches and things that we have seen across the last several months, we have one of them in the press at least every week. One of them was taken back to an open source piece of software. And the breach that was discovered on that was essentially discovered because it was open source software and was actually able to look at and find the problem. And then the analysis was done worldwide and fixed essentially within hours. So any of the other breaches you have a look at, they can't throw that manpower at it. They cannot throw the resources to fix it. And it's quite clear where the problem was. So, you know, I'm not saying that open source software doesn't have bugs. It does. But open source software is just like any other piece of software, except the authors are willing to expose the work to inspection, to be able to go in and really have a look at it. And surely that helps eliminate some of those. So that's them open source things are fighting words for me. But yeah.
But if you keep secrets, you might be better off as well. I remember working on a business computer system no longer marketed, and we all agreed we would misspell the word debug, put 2 G's at the end, and it would go into super user mode, and you'd have the run of the machine, because no one is ever going to misspell debug. And that got reported to us 2 years later, and oh shit, management didn't realize we put a back door in that exposed all sorts of financial records and everything else, and what else was in the code, so an independent group has to come in and do peer review of everything just to make sure we hadn't hidden anything else in there. But when you can keep a secret, sometimes it has its advantages as well. But not long.
You said not in business anymore.
The company is thriving, but that business is long
gone.
gone. Yeah.
Okay, we're at the 9:55. I know we had one question in the back of the room, a gentleman back there, if you want to. We'll take the last question and.
Hi, Frank. I guess just a quick question. You started pointing in the direction of these standards bodies are kind of like sort of green. They're made of people, and so one of the challenges I think there is so much is focused on the technology and less on a bit of the human issue. But a lot of these people are employed by companies with incentives, and those incentives may be somewhat opposed to a complete great cooperative effort. I'm curious if you've seen effective mechanisms to sort of counter some of the selfish gene that each of the participants may have in this volume.
Gets back to the trust question, I think.
That's a tough one.
Or you have the competitor sitting at the table, and if you go halfway, you're going to have your competitor go the other half. So now you ask in this whole game, why withhold the other half when now they're going to get their way? So instead of giving you a partial solution, you're almost forced to give it all. Otherwise, somebody else is going to fill it in. I think, Alan, you said it right. None of us are the owners of all idiots and all geniuses. And if we think we are, you can't send someone to try to game it so half a standard comes up, because someone else is going to see you and they'll be putting the other half in.
I think one of the things that happens is that when something goes to a standards body or when something aims to be standardized, it moves from being a competitive advantage to having the feature to being a competitive advantage of being with the standard, right? And it gives you a bigger market, a market of what we lovingly call frenemies, right? And the interesting part about it is a lot of it depends on the actual situation. A lot of it depends on the people, right? I mean, ForgeRock and Ping are often at loggerheads at any given deal, And yet, myself and John Bradley are very good friends and work together on a lot of these standards because from an industry perspective, it is beneficial to both of us, right? And everybody else at the table, I'm just using those two as an example. And so there has to be the benefit of building a bigger market for everybody to play in. There's no loser except those that don't get involved in the standard, ultimately, if it takes off.
I've written about standards bodies since the mid-'90s, and really, I'm a born cynic, so I'm always looking for, who's cheating the deal. But I would say more often than not, you get people in there, like Alan, who are just passionate about creating something that works and solves a problem, and the logos sort of get checked at the door. At the end of the day, the business development guys want to know what's going on because that helps them. But the people who are sitting there working on these things, they're just technologists at heart, and they want to solve a problem. And they are paid by somebody, but their motivations can lie elsewhere. And the companies know what they're, I think, getting into when they pay these guys. But again, my experience more often than not is that the passion in the room is to create something that's going to solve a problem, not sell a product.
Yeah, in the end, I think standards are politics, and it would be great if we could just get rid of politics altogether, but we never can. We're human, and we tend to, it tends to bring out both the best and the worst of us. So really, we have to sort of look at the bigger picture as vendors, I think, and recognize that the standard isn't necessarily the place to differentiate. The standard is the place to create, common innovation so we can focus our energies, in competition in other places. It's an easy thing to say, but it's actually pretty hard to execute on.
Well, I want to thank our panelists and thank the audience, and we'll be around, so any questions on break or throughout the day, we're here to talk to you. Thanks so much.